I am going to speak today about these big challenges around assessing complex interventions, and I'm going to try and turn a generic adjective into a slightly more refined category of statements about what I think constitutes complexity. I'm also going to argue that the complex development challenges just keep happening and they're only going to intensify. Indeed, the more we succeed in doing a lot of the more everyday, seemingly straightforward things in development, the more we just keep creating complex challenges. Indeed, as we've seen this past week in the United States, even rich countries still have very serious and intense development challenges in the sense that they need to keep building and sustaining robust institutions to do what democratic institutions are supposed to do. So this is not just an issue that we need to worry about in a particular set of countries, in a particular set of projects, or a particular set of sectors. It's something that affects everybody. And the kinds of claims that we make about the impacts of these interventions, and by extension, the kinds of claims we make about the likelihood that these interventions, if they were deemed to work somewhere else, would work in a very different place. It seems to me, as someone who's been very much part of the development research community in Washington and in Cambridge for quite a long time now, that most of our intellectual energy is really centered on the internal validity concern, the identification challenges of getting causality right. In large part, I think, because at least at the elite research level, that's really what you need to get published in fancy journals. But policy, it seems to me, or the issues that we wrestle with in the more applied side of development are hugely to do with external validity. And I came to write this particular, the paper on which this particular presentation is based, in large part because it seemed to me we had people in higher education with regards to internal validity concerns and in kindergarten with regards to external validity concerns. And so I figured the bar was so low actually in the external validity space that I could say something minimally sensible in the hope that others would come along and upgrade and refine that. Nonetheless, I hope that part of the conversations we have here today will help us to collectively figure out a more or a better strategy for engaging with these particular class of interventions that I'm going to call complex interventions. So I'm going to start off with why I think we're in a bit of a hole with this external validity space. And I think it's partly because of the way we talk about ourselves, to ourselves, about impact evaluation. And so I'm going to start by sort of giving two cheers for the evidence-based policy narrative as it's commonly told. And recognize and appreciate its strengths for all the reasons that I think are familiar to everybody in this room, but also look at where I think that narrative runs up against some pretty hard constraints. And I think those are particularly in the space of complex interventions. Then I want to sort of give you a basic analytic framework for thinking about what I think constitutes complex interventions or particular components of particular interventions. Then how we might go about the particular challenge of assessing those particular interventions with regards to making statements about not just whether they're working, but how and for whom they are working. And then move from that to try and discuss these broader questions about, even if we do have defensible reasons and arguments for why a particular intervention is working over there, would we counsel a policymaker to actually adopt that particular intervention as such right here? What kinds of information would we need in order for those kinds of decisions to be made in a more defensible way? I'll provide some examples of that and then conclude by essentially a plea for expanding the ecological space within which we do evaluations, that we don't just create monopolies around what we think is the ways in which we can get defensible and rigorous enough evidence, but recognize that very different problems require very different kinds of strategies in order to be able to unpack them. And that really, for me, is what I've spent most of my life trying to do, is really just not try and replace one system with another, but recognize that there are complements everywhere if we look for it, and that we're asking too much of particular methods if we burden them with assuming the tasks of evaluation for which they weren't actually really suited. And there is a whole literature out there, a whole array of different human knowledge we can tap into if we search for it. But if we just stay in our little disciplinary silos, then we either ignore those or just simply aren't even aware that they are there at all. So that's largely the theme of what I'm going to be talking about, at least concluding on, is the importance of expanding that ecosystem of evaluation options. Okay, so the development policy narrative around evaluation, I think, largely goes something like this, that all of us in development are sort of hamstrung or plagued by inadequate and low quality hard data. And we're too often enthralled to soft methodologies that only produce anecdotes and advocacy. And so we're left with he said, she said kinds of claims. We just don't really have rigorous enough evidence to be able to make these claims. As a result, because there's finite resources that are available and that indeed are often spent inefficiently, and we end up then, as a result of that, finding ourselves in places where we're always on the back foot, as it were, to use cricketing analogies, with regards to defending the effectiveness of the whole aid enterprise more generally, or of particular interventions that we happen to be supportive of. Taxpayers and politicians, as a result of this lack of evidence, remain skeptical and cynical about development, and thus it's the job of researchers to try and fix that. So in that space, then, what we also tend to do is to up the ante and sort of say, well, the way that which in the past that other fields became taken more seriously, the way in which they started to have bigger impact was to become more scientific, and the defining feature of the scientific method is to use randomized controlled trials. So what we in development need to be doing is to be following the model set to us by medicine, and to adopt the kind of approach that they've used, and that will help us to restore or invigorate some serious science into what we're doing. If you hang out in Harvard and MIT, that is explicitly, essentially, the message that we are told. Now, I'm a two cheers kind of guy for all of that. I work in the research department, I teach at Harvard, my bona fides in that domain, I hope, are relatively well established. More and better data is always better. Sound methods always beat sloppy ones. We, of course, need to be accountable for the public resources entrusted to us. It's a matter of professional practice that we should be raising our standards, and meeting high expectations is, of course, a virtue. The problem is, though, that they're so understood, this very rather narrow way of thinking about what constitutes the rigorous way to think about evaluation is very well suited to a very narrow class of interventions, it seems to me. It's exactly the right way to think about a very particular class of interventions, and much more problematic when we ask it to do stuff that it actually is much less suited to. When it's in its appropriate domains, it does indeed yield something we might call a best practice, something that we can regard as being something that's universally true, that has some actual scientific validity that's independent of the context in which it works. And we can also have some confidence that that intervention could be generalized and potentially scaled and replicated elsewhere. So I think trying to reduce traffic congestion, for example, is very well suited to that. Driving is more or less the same kind of skill. The decision rules that the drivers are applying pretty much applies in Delhi as much as it does in Malaysia or anywhere else. And so the kinds of lessons that one might learn under those circumstances, I think, do indeed travel pretty well. But when we get into this complex space, I think we're in a very different area. We need to recognize as a sort of first principle, I think, that rich countries today didn't necessarily become that way, didn't become rich because they adopted more of these kinds of interventions. It's not how the East Asian tigers became really wealthy and overcome their major poverty problems. Doing evaluation as the Cambridge Consensus would have us do it is often hugely expensive and time consuming. There are indeed serious ethical questions around some of the work that's been done. There's often very legitimate political resistance to doing things in ways that might be otherwise in accordance with disciplinary methodological standards, but might not meet a political imperative. We're also, doesn't really help us answer these how questions. It's really good on answering whether something worked on average, but not so good for when we're trying to disaggregate all of that and look for whom these things work, and especially to get inside the black box. Science, in many respects, can be defined by its capacity to shrink the size of the black box, to be able to understand the causal process mechanisms that connect inputs to outcomes. And when we don't have much knowledge about those mechanisms inside the black box, we're in some sense shortchanging what science really would have us do. So those are the kinds of things that I think are the limits of just doing the orthodox approach. It has all these huge upsides which are well understood, but it needs to be complemented by, I think, a different array of tools if we are to tackle the kinds of challenges that now keep confronting us. And I think it's also important that we see evaluation not just as contributing to public good type knowledge, but we see it contributing to knowledge that helps to really build the capability of systems to implement the kinds of tasks that they're doing, so that there's endogenizing of the learning component in real time to help teams of implementers keep on doing the incrementally difficult and sometimes more challenging tasks that their work entails. Now, let me sort of try and have a stab at what I think constitutes the defining characteristics of complex interventions and just get away from a generic adjective. Pretty much everything, of course, in development is complex. That's a given. But I think what we can do to refine that a little bit more is to look at 4 different characteristics that I think characterize high complexity interventions. The first of these is that they involve lots of discretion on the part of implementers. Lots of choice, lots of agency, lots of space for reasonable and sometimes unreasonable people to exercise their judgment. Okay? So a teacher in a classroom, for example, has lots of discretion in the sense that they have to make lots of choices on an hourly, daily, minute-by-minute basis with regards to how they accommodate very different learning styles amongst their pupils. Social work is very highly discretionary a task. When your task is to decide whether to take children out of a dysfunctional family, it's a social worker's frontline call. Maybe a different social worker will make a different call, but there is no deep science behind the social work of taking children kicking and screaming away from their parents because you as the social worker have deemed that family to be sufficiently unfit to look after their children. That is a wrenching, painfully difficult decision, but it has huge high discretion because grounded, hopefully, of course, in some body of professional practice and experience, but very deeply, highly discretionary. The second characteristic of complex interventions is they're very transaction intensive. They require lots of people over long chains of implementation in order to be able to get the outcome that they desire. The work of central bankers, for example, is not highly transaction intensive. A bunch of guys sit around a table a couple of times a year, divine the data, emerge Delphic-like to announce that interest rates are going to go up or down by 1/4 of a point, right? Very important work, very crucial policy tasks that are being undertaken by people that know what they're doing. But there's not a huge amount of transaction intensity with regards to the full implementation chain. Curative healthcare, again, education, other kinds of tasks like that, on the other hand, involve enormous amounts of human interaction. To produce a minimally functioning young adult in today's economy takes at least 10 years of education. And basic mathematics will show you that if you have a child in school for 5 hours a day, for 200 days a year, for those 10 years, 10,000 hours, Malcolm Gladwell's magical number, but 10,000 hours of human interaction to produce minimally the number of people you require, at least 15,000 to produce every single person in this room. That's how much time you've spent in front of other human beings in order to be able to engage at the level we're now engaging it with these very abstract and difficult questions around evaluation. So that's what I mean by it's a complex task, just because there are so many people over such an incredibly long period of time that it takes to produce us. I think another characteristic of complex interventions is that they sometimes impose obligations as opposed to deliver a service. Education, at least, is something that everybody more or less wants and agrees upon. We might have quibbles about details, but there's no serious lobby that's trying to shut down education. Right? But there are tasks that governments perform that entail doing really difficult things, like regulation, like crime and criminal justice. Those kinds of tasks involve getting people to do things they don't fundamentally want to do. Most of us would probably rather pay less taxes than we do. Most of us would rather probably not have to obey every single law that there is on the books, including driving or speeds and all the rest of it. But we do because there is a system that imposes those obligations on us. And if it is your task to be a regulator of a Fortune 500 company, for example, your task is really difficult because the forces of darkness are arrayed against you, being charged $5,000 an hour to make sure that they get what they want. Right? That's what I mean by complex. Right? It's really difficult because people don't actually like you. They don't want you to do your job. Right? And if you're in a situation where you're doing that kind of work, you are a very complex task. One of the last time I was here in Delhi a few months ago was with a team of people brought here to engage in a workshop on trying to do police reform in Afghanistan. And I said yes to these guys that I cannot imagine a more complex, difficult, dangerous policy to have to implement anywhere in the world, right? You do criminal justice reform in Afghanistan, your kids are facing death threats, you may well be kidnapped on your way to work every single day. That is complex, that is deeply complex. The fourth characteristic is that it often entails, there are often problems that emerge as a result of what you're doing for which there is no known solution. There isn't a toolkit, there isn't a handbook readily available that can help you to respond to the challenges that you've just confronted. You essentially have to invent a solution along the way. And a lot of tasks, I think, in implementing these complex interventions around women's empowerment, around the community-driven development work that has been done in many countries around the world. All of this, there isn't a singular blueprint that can happen, that it can be articulated. There isn't a singular set of if this, then that, with regards to how you should respond to the particular challenges. So if you're in a world where you're implementing highly discretionary, highly transaction-intensive, tasks that ask you to impose obligations and generate in and through that implementation process lots of questions for which there isn't a known solution, you are in a very difficult place. And trying to imagine that the orthodox evaluation narrative that I just articulated can pretty much tell you what you need to know in order to be able to help yourself as a practitioner, or more or less, or more broadly, I should say, can help a group called policymakers decide whether they should expand, shut down, or investigate the kind of work that you're doing. I think we're asking that particular modality to do something it wasn't asked to do. And so we need to have a broader array of tools at our disposal to be able to help to do that. So the abiding principle, I think, really since almost undergraduate methodology classes in social science is that we need to match the types of evidence that we are seeking to collect with the types of problems that we are facing, and not the other way around. We don't start with a methodology and then try and shoehorn the particular problems into that methodology. We start with a problem and we figure out a creative way in which we can solve it. And I think the problems that I just articulated according to those four criteria require us to think more broadly about what kinds of evidence we might need to do that. And let me just go through, indulge 5 minutes on just how incredibly different these kinds of challenges look across the broader scope of human knowledge, just so that when we're talking about evaluation questions here in the development space, we recognize that we're part of a bigger intellectual landscape of claim making about processes and ideas, and that our space is a particular place on that map. So let's start with physics, for example. A wonderful, amazing paper published a couple of years ago on the Higgs boson particle, which came out of one of these big super colliders in Europe. And the amazing point about this paper is that there were 5,000 co-authors on it. I kid you not, this is a paper from Nature magazine. 5,000 co-authors on the paper, and all of the whole point of this paper, which took up what did I say there? Something like 33 pages just to outline the co-authors. Right? All of that work, all that incredible brain power was used to be able to try and measure the weight of the Higgs boson particle to within 0.025%. Right? At a subatomic level particles that no one in this room, I imagine, can even get their head around how tiny and small that actually is. 5,000 physics PhDs it takes to figure out whether that is how much it weighs to within a 0.25%. And that then is the sort of the causal basis on which matter, life, the universe, everything exists, right? But to get an accurate statement at the subatomic level, 5,000 people with PhDs in physics to figure out the answer. That's amazing to me. I read that, I just shook my head. I said, I cannot believe it's hard enough writing a paper with 2 people, let alone with 5,000 of them. The division of labor, even if in that sort of space, is just extraordinary, right? And I think, apart from just being wowed at what other people can do for a living, I think it's very humbling to recognize, geez, our universe does not look like that. We are not in a world where we need 5,000 other people to figure out how we can get infinitesimally small particles to be weighed and as a foundation on which our science rests. At the opposite end of the extreme, right, we have historians. And the canonical example is always trying to make sense of World War I. Right? World War I, probably the most epic event of the 20th century, maybe even more so in some sense than the Second World War, because it was a prelude to it. We're now at the 100th year anniversary of all these. If you go into a serious bookstore and go to the World War I section, right, you'll see a whole nice wall full of people authored in books, mostly authored by one, very occasionally 2 people. And you'll have a whole wall of different interpretations 100 years after the fact about how the most epic event of the 20th century went down. Right? So compare that to our friends weighing the Higgs boson particle, and think about historians trying to make sense of this mega cataclysmic event for which clearly happened, right? And there were causal pathways by which we got to a world in which everybody started slaughtering each other en masse. But within, and it's not a completely open season as to how that occurred, but do we have a rigorous answer for how that happened? No. Are historians a bit dull because they haven't figured it out after 100 years? No. Right? That's just the nature of the problem they're tackling. They're tackling this incredibly hyperspace problem, and it takes one mind just to be able to hold all these different simultaneous events in motion at one time. And every 5 or 6 years, we get maybe another breakthrough in scholarship or another interpretation of those events. But it's not for want of high IQ that we're still in a world 100 years later where we haven't figured out how this big epic event occurred. You could pretty much say a similar thing about partition in India or any of the other big events that have occurred over the 21st century. So these very different problems require very different skill sets, very different mindsets, and the absence or presence of an answer is not really a function of either the brain power, the commitment, or the methodology per se that has been used. It's people doing what their particular skill sets ask of them. In medicine, right, here's a nice little graph showing all of the studies that have been done to try and show what causes cancer, okay? And even take something that Indians love, like tea. Does it cause cancer according to published research in peer-reviewed journals? Well, some of them say yes, some of them say no. Would that band be a little narrower if we had a few more RCTs thrown in there, or only privileged RCT results be included in our universe of cases that we considered? Maybe. But the point is, really smart people working the best they can to try and make pretty important consequential causal statements about the impacts of something on something else in the medicine still have huge degrees of variability. Even more crazy is how this works in the external validity space. And since so often we're told we should be invoking the sort of the metaphor of biological medicine as the basis on which we should work, we should consider this cute little mouse there on the screen. That cute little mouse is called Black 6. Black 6 has been genetically engineered over the last 40 years or so to be the mouse of choice for doing all of the tests on various different pain medicines and all the rest before it gets transferred to humans. So this poor little critter is the object of many scientists' love precisely because it's been used for testing out the effects of so many different things at their experimental stages. Literally every chromosome, every DNA molecule, everything about that particular creature is known, down to the cell. Right? And it's been replicated, and it's the beauty of it, of course, that it is used all over the world so that researchers in New Zealand and the Netherlands can all do research on exactly the same causal agent, or the intervening context in this case, this Black 6. But in a recent review of all the work that had been done trying to look at the generalizability of the claims that were being made about the mouse, and I'll quote here, Black 6 turns out to be a teenaged alcoholic couch potato with a weakened immune system, and he might be a little hard of hearing. Right? So poor old Black 6 is not even representative of mice, let alone of rodents, let alone of mammalian species, let alone a lot of other things, leading a major systematic review of all of this work to conclude that years and billions of dollars had been compromised. Right? This is in the space of the field where causality is pretty well understood, where we have an agent in this case that we thought we understood at the cellular DNA level, and yet even there, it turns out that the extrapolation question, the generalizability problem, is enormous. Right? So we have physics at one end, medicine kind of in the middle, and history at the other. All of this a hyperspace, all of this with very different degrees of exactitude with regards to which we can understand causal processes. And I think a lot of what we're doing in development sits much more in the space between medicine and history than we want to think. We want to think that we can cleanly and neatly identify the causal role that particular projects are having or particular components of interventions are having. I think we need to be much more holistic with regards to recognizing that, geez, even the people we're supposed to be emulating have deep existential crises over these very basic questions. If they can't figure it out, we should be increasingly, I think, much more modest about what we think we can claim on the basis of the work that we're doing. Even in sports, right? We don't set up a world in which some sports are perceived to be more rigorously assessed than others, right? The bobsled there on the upper left, I can tell who wins a gold medal there down to the nearest 1,000th of a second. That's the distinction between whether you win a gold medal or not, right? But in rodeo or in ice dancing or surfing, we assess all of those very differently. We don't impute that these are less rigorously assessed, right? Those are assessed according to the logic of how they're conducted. And I think we should be assessing much of the stuff we do in development as best we can and as optimally and as efficiently and effectively as we can, but without trying to imagine that it's our method that should determine this hierarchy of claiming with regards to the conclusions that we draw. Okay, so I'm going to run out of time here because I'm having too much fun, but I want to, there's a sort of a crux around which I think much of our thinking in the complex development space falls. And I want to spend the last bit of my talk really just walking you through why I think this particular component is so consequential, both on the internal validity space with regards to making claims about causal impacts, but also with regards to the external validity, the generalizability of what we're doing. One of the characteristics of complex interventions is that even when they're very faithfully implemented, carefully designed, fully funded, and politically supported, is they generate these huge variabilities in their outcome, big standard deviations in effect. So in one study that I was part of last year, looking at service delivery in the Middle East, for example, this simple graph on the right was looking at Yemen, a country in the Middle East, like many of them, with a very centralized policy apparatus. And the policy, of course, is that health workers and teachers should show up for work every day, right? And they've all been trained at the same place, they all get paid the same salaries, and yet the absenteeism rate in that space varies from 8 to 83%, right? That's not a policy problem, that's a key implementation challenge, right? And so what can we do to learn from those kinds of forms and sources of variation? Another defining characteristic, I think, of which makes the challenge of identification super difficult is that oftentimes there really isn't a counterfactual. The only real counterfactual is other instances of itself. By virtue of constantly adapting and morphing with its context and being refined and iterated over time, by definition, that counteracts many of one of the key core assumptions that makes randomization possible, the unit homogeneity assumption that everyone should be receiving the same treatment, exactly the same treatment as others. And once you have a space within which people can adapt what they're doing and make mid-course or even real-time course corrections, it makes it really difficult to claim that you have a true counterfactual. Another defining characteristic is that they are like Tolstoy's unhappy families. The good ones are all pretty much the same, but the unhappy ones are unhappy in their own way. The famous opening line to Anna Karenina, but I think this notion of reciprocal variables, that the variables that don't work the same when they're going in a positive direction as when they're going in a negative direction, I think we need to do much more work about thinking how that plays out in our claims of evaluation. Because once you're in a space where things aren't working in a hyperspace, in a complex space, then it's not clear exactly where the breakdowns occurred, because it's almost impossible to truly isolate each of those on its own. So what do we do about all of this? I think one of the things we need to do is to endogenize research during implementation. And the stars here in India are certainly, I think, the social observatory that my good friend and colleague Vijendra Rao has set up. A very bold and innovative attempt to try and put research, see the task of research as to help the process of implementation, not to be the jury and judge over the impact of any particular intervention after the fact. Have a vested, put yourself into that space as part of the process by which improvements occur. The other thing I think we need to do is not just see ourselves as trying to measure the effects of causes, which is what mainstream evaluation does. It starts with a cause and it tries to test out its impact over time. We can start at the other end of the chain and work backwards. We can start with an effect, an outcome, and then try and figure out the cause. In essence, to look at the causes of effects and not just the effects of causes. This is what historians do. Most of what historians do start with an outcome. World War I happened, and then try and work their way back up the rabbit hole to try and figure out where were these critical junctures that happened that could have gone somewhere else, that are unobservable, but a good forensic research can help you show that at that particular critical juncture, the path led one way rather than another. But to get a hold of this, I think the most basic thing that we really need to do is to have a theory of change. And what I mean by that is we need to have a much stronger sense of what is it reasonable to expect a particular complex intervention, or any intervention for that matter, to do at a particular time. So it's one of my nice little famous quotes on this, but when nothing seems to help, says Jacob Riis, I go back and look at the Stonecutter hammering away at his rock, perhaps 100 times, without as much as a crack showing in it. Yet at the 101st blow, it will split in two. And I know it was not that blow that did it, but all that had gone before. Right? Wonderful metaphor for looking at change that seems to be obscure, that seems to be not having any particular impact until the 101st blow. Right? What does the Stonecutter have? The Stonecutter has a theory. The theory is, I'm going to tap away at this rock in seeming futility. But I know, because of this work that I'm doing, eventually on the 101st tap, that's when the impact will occur. So we call a punctuated equilibrium. Lots of nothingness and then suddenly a big upward change. What would we do if we were evaluating the Stonecutter at the 92nd tap? How effective are you, Mr. Stonecutter? What have you got to show for all your tapping? Nothing. Failure. Right? He said, no, that's a wrong interpretation. The stone cutting takes 100 taps before you get the 101st one to finally work. Same thing with sunflowers and acorns. Right? If I was going to do a test on your horticultural skills and I gave you 2 random seeds and I've got you to put them in the ground and water them and tend them and say nice things to them, and I said I'm going to come back in 6 weeks and measure the effectiveness of your work by the height of the plant that you've now grown, and unbeknownst to you, one group had got the sunflowers and one group had got the acorns. Right? The sunflowers have got a nice 6-foot high thing and are beaming with the great success that they've achieved. And the poor people with acorns have got nothing because it takes 6 months before even an acorn even germinates and you get one little tiny little bud stepping out of the ground. No one would claim on the basis of that we should award the great success story to the sunflower growers and failure to the acorns. Why? Because we have a theory that says acorns grow really slowly and sunflowers grow really fast. Right? Well, think about that for the different kinds of interventions we're doing in development. How many of them are like the Stonecutter? How many of them are like the acorn? They just take a heck of a long time to be able to actually see fruition. In the case of women's empowerment, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1793. And you don't need me to tell you that what sort of discourse surrounding the election in the United States shows that we are a long way from that. We're from realizing anything like that. Right? So does that mean that all the efforts to date have failed? Or does it just mean you're on one heck of a long, brutal road in order to be able to change something as difficult, dangerous, and hardwired, seemingly, as getting to gender equality? I think a lot of what we now find ourselves wrestling with in development is kind of in that space. It's in the space where we're now trying to change things that have always and everywhere been really difficult. And if we set ourselves 3-year time horizons with baselines and follow-ups and claim success purely on what the net difference is between the end of those two things, then we are misjudging the kind of task that we are engaged in. Gordon Brown famously said of building the rule of law that the hardest part about it was the first 500 years. And I think that's true too. I think getting a world in which powerful people are constrained by this abstraction called the law is a wonder of the modern world, but it's not something we take for granted. And all of us who are engaged in justice reform projects of one kind or another know just how incredibly difficult that is. But to imagine that orthodox evaluation tools, as I've described them, can really are the way in which we should make claims about whether these things work or not seems to me not the right way to think about it. So when you think about the standard evaluation, and we just have a baseline and follow-up, that's the usual way in which we look at these kinds of things, and controlling for all the things we need to control for. But I think if you recognize that the different kinds of trajectories that we might see can unfold, you will recognize that I think that you make very different kinds of claims. So the green line is the Stonecutter, right? 100 blows on that rock with nothing to show for it, or the acorn in the ground for many weeks with nothing to show for it, and then suddenly there is a big change. Conversely, I think a lot of women's empowerment projects are J-curves. They get worse before they get better. By trying to empower marginalized groups, the first thing that happens is that powerful people double down and start to thwart those efforts. And if your indicator is violence against women, then that's in many situations what you are probably likely to see. In the happier but equally vexing space, you might have a project that's a superstar, a shooting star project that does really wonderfully, like that top one. But you recognize, I hope, by the point of these different lines is to show that the kind of claim you would draw would be entirely a function of when you did your evaluation. If we were to do the evaluation at point B, for example, rather than point C tells you exactly the same thing. But you would draw very different conclusions if you're on 4 different trajectories at point B. And I think we don't have a good theory of change yet. Why we're not yet a science is because we don't have a theory that underpins the kinds of interventions that we do that would help guide the kinds of expectations and benchmarking that we would then need to be able to make the kinds of claims that we need to make. And this is true in the externalability space if you push that into the future, right? Each of those lines is on very different kinds of trajectories, and thus its likely trajectory into the future is also very different. Scaling up and replicating, I think, is also a big challenge here as well. The big project that I studied when I first came to the bank in Indonesia was okay as a pilot project. It was sort of given an adequate grade, I guess, when it was done as a pilot, but it became successful. It got better as it got bigger because it had all the political support that was needed to be able to turn it from an obscure project into a national flagship project that was too big to fail. Other work that my colleague David McKenzie has done showing a pilot intervention that got spectacular results as a small-scale pilot, but then when it went to scale, failed miserably because then it was seen as an instrument that the government was using to try and take over the small business activities of mom and pop store level businesses, and suddenly nobody wanted to have anything to do with this business registration exercise. So if X gets us Y, and then the assumption that 10X will get us 10Y, I think is great mathematics and terrible social science. I just think it doesn't help us to be able to make the kinds of decisions that we need to be able to make. So final words. We need some certain key facts in order to be able to help us do this. This idea comes from Nancy Cartwright, probably the leading philosopher of social science in the world today, I think. She doesn't actually provide some of these key facts, so I'm going to just conclude by suggesting what I think some of those are. One of them is to just take this whole question of causal density much more seriously than we have, or this array of the 4 different factors that I outlined to you before about what characterizes and defines a complex intervention. I think we need to have a much more informed sense about whether the capability for implementation is of the agency that you're now asking to do this particular work. Justin Sandifer at the Center for Global Development has done wonderful work in Africa showing how an intervention that was produced a wonderful, cleanly identified result with one implementing agency then produced entirely different results when exactly the same intervention was implemented by somebody else. Because the capability to actually do what the policy desired was very different in both of those cases. I think we need to have substance about the contextual compatibility of the contexts in which the work is going to be done. Some places this work will be gratefully received. In some cases it will be perceived as a direct threat. The work we did in Indonesia several years ago now, looking at this big local government reform project, was all about trying to show that in some places these reforms were really welcomed by local political elites. Notions of transparency and accountability were things they were okay with. Notions of transparency and accountability, if you're trying to protect your little fiefdom, is something you deem a great existential threat to your nice little world, and you do everything you can to subvert that particular project and make sure it doesn't work, even when the design is the same, even when the broader political class thinks it's a good thing, and even when it's fully funded. So these four things that I've mentioned, this degree of causal density, the capability to implement, the receptivity in the context, and then, as we've just talked about, the sense to which we have reasoned expectations about the kinds of impacts we're likely to see over time. All of those together, I think, constitute the kinds of factors that we need to be thinking about much more seriously when we engage in the necessary but important but vexed challenge of trying to take an intervention from one context to another, or from one scale to a larger scale. These are the kinds of issues that I hope that the evaluation community will take more seriously as it moves forward. We've got plenty to do just in the orthodox space, and nothing I said should be seen as a critique of that orthodoxy. I think it's, for the most part, exactly what we need to be doing for a certain class of interventions. My final plea and concluding plea is that if we are going to be, and I think we are, encountering much more of these kinds of complex problems as a result of success. After we've paved the roads, we've built the schools, we've put up the hospitals, everything after that then becomes an implementation challenge around which the same imperative to make claims about effectiveness still reside, but around which I don't think we yet have the corresponding theory and method to be able to make the claims we need to do. And I hope that's something that this particular group, 3IE, can champion, and I hope that researchers can as well. Thank you very much.